the fact that I'm not on social media and that you are does not mean that you can say whatever you want to on social media and just be irresponsible with our relationship that way. Did you actually say on Twitter that the Father Brown mysteries are not good?
I did say
I mean, like, I don't know how long this podcast or this relationship is going to last if you continue to do things like that. You know, even though I am not on Twitter, you have to know that these things are going to somehow be communicated to me, and that when you speak against an author who I love like Chesterton and books that I love like the Father Brown mysteries, it's going to have a negative effect on our relationship.
Look, G.K. Chesterton is brilliant. I love G.K. Chesterton. The books are well written, and in the way most of his books are well written, but they're not good mystery stories.
That's because the mystery story is not really about mysteries. So if you're accustomed to mysteries that are just like entertaining stories, you know, detective fiction, that's not what the Father Brown mysteries are. They're far more philosophical and theological than they are just entertaining literature.
And yet Dorothy Sayers is able to do both of those things very well.
Well, I have not read her mystery.
That's all I'm trying to say, is that Sayers is actually far superior to G.K. Chesterton, that by comparison, Chesterton's mystery stories are just not very good. They're not very, I don't know, like he just kind of knows things and doesn't explain how he knows them, right? In fact, I think Dorothy Sayers' detective fiction is better than Sherlock Holmes, to be perfectly honest. And I love Sherlock Holmes.
So I'm going to have to read these stories by Dorothy Sayers, clearly.
You would like them?
I probably would.
She takes a 20-something's nihilistic bachelor who is wealthy and living a pretty meaningless life, whose only joy is solving mysteries, right? And she, by the end of the series of books she writes, she turns them into a Christian family man.
Well, I like that trajectory. But
Yeah.
you just can't say that the Father Brown stories are not good. You lose all credibility.
Just to be clear, like I said, they're not good mystery novels, and they're not. If that's, I mean, I understand what you're saying. If they're meant to discuss religion and philosophy, I mean, that's fine, right? But my point is that I think he could have done all that and done appropriate service to the genre itself.
Someone needs to read G.K. Chesterton more. Are you ready to start?
Maybe you do need to read him a little more closely.
I read him pretty closely. Can we start?
Sure.
All right, I'm Joel.
I'm Jacob.
And this is the Tolle Lege podcast, where we talk about great books, why you should read the great books, and encourage you and equip you in doing.
Death can't hold you, no, it won't hold you. Death can't hold you in that grave, no. Death can't hold you, no, it won't hold you. I know you've risen and you reign in me. Yes, you reign in me.
It's our first Christmas special.
Basically,
Yeah. I think maybe this will be an annual thing where we have it. Because we were going to do Abolition of Man and kind of called an audible. And I just said, hey, let's do this, right?
And here we are.
Here we are.
Here we are.
Christmas special.
Very good.
I'm excited.
So what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Classic.
A lot of people probably don't know of this story. It's kind of
Yeah, it's a very obscure, very infrequently referenced in pop culture. Most people have probably never read it. We'll have to be careful not to spoil it because people are so unfamiliar with it.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Actually, it's funny. My wife, who's teaching 5th and 6th grade at the school we teach at, had a student who had never heard of it before.
Wow.
Didn't know who Scrooge was. Just no conception of the story at all, which was really kind of amazing, but also kind of cool. Like, so he loved it, so it was neat. That
In all seriousness, this story is kind of ubiquitous in modern Western civilization, and even people that have never read the book have certainly seen one of the many adaptations of it. And I don't know how it's astonishing to me that you could have a student that would not even know of the character.
I agree. I mean, like I was going through just the other day trying to say, I wonder how many adaptations there actually are of A Christmas Carol. Well, I couldn't scrape the bottom of the barrel. I think there's got to be in excess of 50 and probably I just don't even know how many, right? But more than 50 of these things, and I listed just a few here. So the George C. Scott version was one of the older versions, but much beloved. A number of years ago, probably over 10 years ago now, Jim Carrey did with Scrooge in an animated version. You've got Captain Picard, his version, Patrick Stewart, who played Scrooge as well. You've got a derivative of it called Scrooge with Bill Murray. Of course, you've got Mickey's Christmas Carol with Scrooge McDuck, Bah Humduck with Daffy from Looney Tunes, the Muppets version, which is my personal favorite, and even just recently released a movie called Spirited with Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds, which is kind of playing off of the Christmas Carol anyway.
So many of those demonstrating my thesis in earlier episodes that great books should not be made into movies.
And his other thesis that I watch too much television.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Jacob was listing these off for me, and I thought, first of all, I never would have been able to come up with that list. I knew it had been done a lot. And secondly, I think I've only seen maybe 2 of those.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 of those.
I really enjoy a number of these, certainly some more than others. Which is the best one? I mean, I can barely ask you that question because you just admitted you but I would definitely argue that the Muppets Christmas Carol is the finest representation of the book.
I don't think I've seen that one.
And I say that a little tongue in cheek because obviously you got Muppets running around in this thing,
right?
But in some senses, I'm quite sincere about that. One of the things that Muppets Christmas Carol does that, to the best of my knowledge, no other version of it does, is it includes a lot of Dickens' narration. So most of it, the narration just goes away, and you've got the lines of the characters and things like that. But Gonzo being Mr. Dickens in the movie, right? Actually, and they bring some of the word for word, some of the narration from the books. I really like that feature. And it's just good fun. It really catches the spirit of it, I guess I'd say.
Sure. Our family last year went to one of the local theaters and saw a community production of A Christmas Carol that was just so exceptionally well done. I know other friends of ours go and see it every year. It's kind of a classic local thing, and I thought it was a very faithful adaptation, for the stage of this great story. So I'm not entirely opposed to some kind of visual media representation, especially of this particular story, as great as it is. But I do think it lends itself well to the theater, and maybe that's even superior to film. But I'm just biased.
Well, it's definitely, there's something amazing about live theater. I think even just the sense that it could all go wrong.
Right.
Add something to the excitement of it, right?
Yeah.
If somebody just botches their scene.
There's something authentic about it, right? Because you've literally got the person standing in front of you saying their lines, right? And that there's no editing, there's no post-production. It's happening right now.
Right, yeah. No, absolutely. So, just to be clear, are you saying that this is one great book that it's permissible?
I just think it's been done so many times that it's bound to stumble upon a semi-decent adaptation at some point.
Fair.
Yeah.
Of which the Muppets Christmas Carol is by far the best.
I'll have to take your word for it. Maybe I need to watch that this Christmas season.
You really should.
Yeah.
You'll hate it because you hate most things that I love. So.
Bah! Humbug!
That's not really true.
Okay, that's not true. That's a bit unfair. It's pretty close to the truth when it comes to movies and
the reason the banter in this show actually works is because you and I agree on 97 out of 100 things, but the 3 things we disagree on so strongly that it's really entertaining when we do so.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I like fun and you hate it, and that's it's fine, I get it. So,
pretty sure that's not a fair characterization.
I'll let them be the judge. It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. Hey, what do you love about this book?
Yeah. Undoubtedly, the story of Scrooge's redemption is my favorite part of it. I mean, you almost have to say that because it's kind of the overriding theme of the book.
Sure.
There are a lot of individual characters, individual scenes, individual themes that I love and enjoy. Going back through the story once again, getting ready for this episode, just seeing anew how many things are precious and familiar in it. But the story of Scrooge's redemption and his discovery of life and joy and peace in community is just really a very powerful part of this story.
Yeah.
So yeah, favorite part for sure. What
Yeah,
about you?
I mean, it's hard to disagree with that, obviously.
Yeah.
But there's just so many things that I really enjoy about it. One of the things that I found in this last read through, just moving to the point of teary-eyed, reading the book, is just the portrayal of the Cratchit family.
Yeah.
Like the powerful love they have for each other, and it just feels very genuine and
Right.
very good and very wholesome, and it's just a great picture. So I really enjoy that aspect a lot. Literarily, I just really enjoy Dickens' diction, his word choice, the way he brings illustrations across. His use of repetition really struck me this time. I made it a point to circle words and phrases that he was reusing a lot, and I could easily see from another pen it just feeling baselessly repetitive, but he brings it across in a way that's just full of meaning, and I may give some examples of that later on. But I really enjoy this book from start to finish. You talk about books that you reread every year or every 5 years or whatever your different plans are, but this is a book that I heartily recommend. Read this book every year at Christmas.
Right.
And I want to make the point too that I don't care how many adaptations you've seen of the book and love and cherish and good for you. That's great. If you haven't actually read the book, you have failed to really encounter the story the way you need to.
This is the important point about saying that maybe great books should not be made into movies, is because no film, no matter how well done, can do justice, can adequately represent and communicate all that is in that story. And that's why I would just argue great films are their own thing, great plays are their own thing, and great stories are their own thing. And books, generally they should be left as books. But certainly in the case of A Christmas Carol, a lot of the adaptations, even the ones that we might say are fairly accurate or are doing justice to the broader themes of the story, they just can't capture everything that is in the book. And it's not a hard read. It's not a long read. It's easy to do as a read aloud with your family at Christmas time. It's easy to go through yourself. And a lot of people could probably go through it in an afternoon without straining themselves. So it's very accessible and well worth the investment of time.
Yeah. I mean, even, reading what they call chapters in this book, they call staves, which we'll mention about that in just a second. But reading a stave a day, leading up to Christmas. There's only 5 of them,
So I decided to kind of skip over our lightning round questions this episode, but it's a special Christmas episode.
It
so
is a special.
Right, we can do different things. But one of the questions I was going to ask you is, what books do you like to reread at Christmas time? Do you have any particular? Because I do. I've got books that I go back to at Christmas time every year, A Christmas Carol being one of them. But are there other books that you find yourself drawn to kind of in that end of the year winter season?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I'm a little more haphazard than you are, Joel, which I think people pick up on that theme. But A Christmas Carol is the one for me that pretty much without fail I come back to this time of year. It's almost a religious observance for me.
Right.
Like it's and I think it's because it does such a great job portraying the gospel in such vivid terms.
Yes.
But no, I don't know that I have one book that at this time of year inspires me to read. But I'd be interested to know what some of your other ones are.
Yeah, so I always reread the Chronicles of Narnia.
That makes sense.
Usually the week of Christmas, sometimes a couple of weeks leading into Christmas. And when we were talking earlier before we started recording about books that have Christmas as a central theme,
right?
Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe would be like one of my first answers.
Right. Father Christmas.
It's just so
always winter, never Christmas. How
the
important?
spell begins to break, right? And you know it because it's finally Christmas. Father Christmas has arrived. Those are books that for me are always associated with Christmas. And I was thinking about our friend Dane was mentioning just a couple of days ago about certain families reading Pilgrim's Progress as a family read aloud on Sunday nights, and just having that as kind of a family tradition over the years. Having a family tradition of reading A Christmas Carol every Christmas season. Again, to your point, one stave for each of the 5 days leading up to Christmas. That's a really good tradition, and maybe it's just a good thing to think about, whether it's with regard to this book or something else, having those few books that really belong to your family and having those kind of traditions. We were talking in our last episode about the importance of societal rituals, communicating values. And if books and the ideas found in great books are things that we value, how do we incorporate that into the life and the rhythm of our family?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just thinking about how do we, as a family, have these things that are important to us, that are we come back to again and again and again throughout the year. And this is, family worship. I mean, obviously, the most central thing, right? Gathering together regularly as a family to read scripture, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. But at the same time, there are so many other great pieces of literature that are outside of scripture that would still be encouraging to us as Christians.
Yes.
And you mentioned, last week we did the Giver. And I was just thinking about how that Christmas is actually an important theme in The Giver as well.
Yes.
We didn't touch on it in the last podcast, last episode.
And you have to pay attention to pick up on this, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not part of the society that is.
Right.
But it's, well, I don't know how much we want to say.
I
right?
know, it's really hard to say because it ties into the ending of the book, actually.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So, but be looking for that. So there's a sense, and as strange as it may be, when you start reading The Giver, you're like, how is this a Christmas book? Well, it actually kind of is.
Yeah, and this raises another point that maybe kind of brings us into starting to break down this book. I mentioned last week, the idea of reading dystopian literature and specifically The Giver as kind of a work of Christian imagination, while acknowledging that that's probably not Lois Lowry's intent and maybe not in any way representative of her particular worldview or faith commitments. And I got some feedback after that episode from people who were like, this seems like that's not at all the position that she's working from and not at all what she imagined. But it's to remember something that we've said many times before, and that is that all true stories, all great stories, are ultimately echoing, reflecting, recapitulating the true story, right? So all of the myths are true and good and beautiful insofar as they echo the one true myth, which is, of course, the Christ story. In the case of A Christmas Carol, we actually have Dickens self-consciously writing a work of Christian imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fair to say this is clearly a Christian work. It's written on Christian premises. It's got explicitly Christian themes and even explicitly Christian religion woven into the very fabric of the story. So here, we're not wondering, is this an atheist trying to say something about the world that inadvertently is stating something true? In this case, it's using imagination to communicate explicitly Christian ideas.
Yeah. And I think, we could note, like, sadly, Dickens towards the end of his life made some unfortunate decisions. And so I don't make any final judgment on where he is with the Lord. But at the same time, there's no doubt that he wrote out of a Christian worldview, a Christian context. All of England at that time was essentially Christian in the larger sense of that term, right? And so that tradition, that way of thinking and engaging the world was just in the marrow of the bones of really everybody who wrote during that time. Even those who were trying to reject Christianity actively were still, as we've talked about before, sharing some of the presuppositions of the day, right?
Yeah, and a lot of Dickens' work, obviously, is a critique of things that he saw in society at that time, which included hypocrisy and negligence on the part of a pseudo-Christian, culturally Christian community, and yet even that, what is the foundation for his moral and social critique? It's a Christian worldview, right? I mean, you're not critiquing a Christian worldview by means of a secular worldview. You are critiquing the incipient secularism from a Christian standpoint in this kind of literature.
Well, very good. Well, hey, let's jump into the book proper a bit. And so there are, as we mentioned already, 5 staves, which are like chapters. But why staves? What in the world is that about?
Yeah, so we were talking about this earlier, that this is a term that could refer to a stanza of poetry or of song, and that appears to be the way that Dickens is using it.
It is a Christmas carol. Obviously.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah. That this is not just to be thought of as a novel, that these are not chapters, but that these are portions of the song that is being sung, that is telling the story, this particular story of a man's redemption in the context of Christmas, which of course, great Christmas hymns, great Advent hymns, that's what they do. They're like epics. They tell the story of Christ. Well, in this case, this is the story of how the work of Christ is being brought near to a man who is apart from Christ, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah, I think in labeling this a Christmas carol and calling the chapters staves, he does join in the great tradition.
Yeah.
All the way back to Homer, who starts off about, "Oh, sing Achilles of the wrath of Achilles," right? To Dante, maybe more pertinently, Dante in his Inferno and of course the rest of the trilogy there, but has the cantos. Each chapter is called a canto, and just as Virgil was Dante's guide into the underworld, right? We see that Scrooge is met by some different guides in this story.
Yeah, and is led through kind of purgatory and hell to ultimately be brought to salvation, right?
Yes.
And to paradise.
Yes.
And you made this connection with Dante that I had never thought about that. I mean, I don't know how many times I've read A Christmas Carol, a lot, and I had never made that connection. That is a brilliant insight, and I it's one of those things. As soon as you said it, it was so self-evident that you say, "How did I miss it?" Right? So it's kind of a bittersweet realization that, wow, isn't that awesome? How did I not see that before? But it certainly would seem to me that Dickens is deliberately playing on that idea, because it's certainly the experience that Scrooge has.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. I got to just thinking about it because just asking myself a question, why staves?
Why
right?
staves?
And just kind of went down that rabbit hole. And then, of course, thinking about the other literary connections he makes in the book. I mean, I'm just thinking, obviously,
So many.
Of course, Dickens is steeped in the great tradition. Of
Yes.
course, this is influencing what he's doing.
Yes.
Right? So.
Yes. Yeah, and this raises a good point for listeners and viewers, that in order to find some of these connections, you simply need to learn to ask good questions. So just like Jacob is saying there, why staves? Why not chapters? Why not? Why call it anything at all, right? And it's asking those kinds of questions that sometimes will lead you to see connections that are intended by the author, but that were not maybe as obvious to you until you just paused.
Fire up your curiosity when you're reading
Right.
a book.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Interested is interesting.
Yep.
So if you choose to be interested, and if you choose to take seriously what you're reading and look for things to wonder about, you'll find them.
Yes.
Right? And
Yes.
you'll find, even books you've read, maybe a lot, right? You'll find new things all the time.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
I want to just start off. I mean, it's appropriate. One of the most famous starts to a book,
Right.
but I think we just need to read it anyway.
Go for it.
Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail.
Yeah.
I mean, what a phenomenal opening, right?
Right.
I mean, I don't know how anybody doesn't pick that up and say, ooh.
Right. Exactly.
I want to keep
Exactly.
going,
Yes. Yes.
And he emphasizes, over and over, you cannot miss this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's utterly important that you understand Marley is really and truly long since dead.
And of course, it immediately raises the question of why are we emphasizing
Yeah,
this? And you get some indication of it when you notice that Stave 1 is entitled Marley's Ghost.
Mm-hmm.
So this certainly dead individual is about to show up in some way, shape, or form.
One of the things I mentioned earlier about his use of repetition, the word soul appears 5 times on the first page of this, right? He was at Marley's funeral, Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, there's like 6, his sole assign, his sole residuary, his sole friend, and sole mourner. I mean, just this kind of repetition, but emphasizing the loneliness.
Yes.
Of Marley's life, that there was only one person to even do all this important work after his death.
And not only Marley's, but Scrooge's as well, because you're seeing in this first stave how isolated Scrooge truly is. He's in an office. He has a clerk, Bob Cratchit, who we'll meet later on. But he lives alone. He eats alone. He is all alone. And even when he goes back to his house this first night, it's so dark that even though he knows the way, right? He's lived there for so long. Even he himself is, is finding it necessary to kind of feel his way through. And I think there's very clearly, kind of a metaphorical allusion to the loneliness, to the isolation, to the darkness of Scrooge's whole life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I think there's very intentional mirroring of Scrooge and Marley.
Yes.
So Scrooge actually is living in Marley's old quarters.
Correct.
Right. So Scrooge is simply just literally taking up residence
Yes.
in Marley's situation
For the last 7 years since
Yeah.
Marley died. And then you notice the parallels, or kind of the antithetical parallelism, between stave 1 and stave 5. So in stave 1, Scrooge, like Marley, is living entirely in isolation, right? He is the walking dead. Marley is the walking dead, right? And in stave 5, Scrooge is now in community. Like, he's flinging the windows open. He's talking to the people in the streets. He is participating in corporate worship. He's participating in family celebrations. He is greeting his clerk and the joy and fullness, but it's only in the context of community. And so you're seeing these kind of bookends, these antithetical bookends in the story, where just like Marley is a walking dead person, Scrooge is the walking dead, who is in darkness and ignorance.
Yeah.
But it's seen apart from human community. There's no, I don't want to anticipate too much of where we're going, but there's no salvation in isolation. There's no redemption that leaves you alone. All of the damned in hell are alone.
Yeah.
They're in outer darkness.
Well,
all of the redeemed are in the host of glorified saints.
The Great Divorce.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if you've read The Great Divorce, and if you haven't, you should.
Get on that,
Yeah,
please.
you should go and just stop what you're doing right now and stop listening to this podcast. Just go read Great Divorce, then come back. But Great Divorce, Lewis pictures the people in hell constantly getting further and further and further away from each other, driving themselves into further and further obscurity.
Yes.
And it's a self-inflicted kind of punishment in a sense. But regardless, yeah, it's this absolute loneliness.
Yeah.
And it drives them mad.
Yes, exactly.
But now, you see, you're mentioning this, and I hadn't really thought about it quite like this, but I'm thinking now that the structure of this book is probably chiastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. so I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, there's so many things we can talk about here, so let's just kind of jump into some of them. One of the things that I found interesting in this last rereading of the book was the personification of weather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what are some ways maybe that we see that, even just in the first stave? How does that interact with the characters of the book?
Yeah.
Did you see anything there?
Well, certainly the cold. The cold is a really important idea, and the coldness of the office, the coldness of the house, the coldness of Scrooge's heart, and the fact that he's content to live in the cold, right, as it were. And again, I think you're going to see that kind of antithetical parallelism later on. But Scrooge is never getting warm. He's living in this frigid environment, and so I guess that's one at least environmental piece.
Yeah, absolutely. It says external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge.
Right.
No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him.
Yeah.
And then one thing that I thought was interesting, though, is this lack of effect that weather has on Scrooge because he's colder than it could possibly be, right? But then you have enter Fred, enter his nephew.
Yep.
And as he comes into Scrooge's workplace, it says he had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. And so there's just this antithesis,
That's right.
that the cold has the the opposite effect you might expect on this young man.
Yes, there's another case of that very antithesis as his nephew is leaving. His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. So it's not just about body heat. It's
Right.
not just about the perception of our environment. It's about the coldness of Scrooge's reception and the warmness of Bob Cratchit's response, right, to Fred.
Just a passing comment, really. I don't know how much we want to develop this idea, but I was enchanted by the fact that when he starts the story proper, he actually uses the phrase "once upon a time,"
Right. Yeah.
and which is the classic fairy tale setup, right? So he's just self-consciously working through that. So I just thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah.
One of the things that actually I never really thought about this until this last reading. And again, I think it's because I have watched so many different adaptations of this, and you kind of that whitewashes sometimes the stories.
Yep.
So but in Stave 1, even though you meet Scrooge's nephew, even though you meet his clerk, they're not named.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think they're not named?
Yeah, because it's emphasizing Scrooge's impersonal life. Right? That again, he doesn't live in community. He doesn't live in relationships. Even when his nephew is wanting to have a relationship with him, Scrooge is absolutely unwilling. These are not even truly people as far as he's concerned. He is concerned and consumed only with himself and his wealth that he is hoarding, right? And kind of the misery. He's bent inward, Augustine would say. And so I think that's a really great observation, that you have two key characters introduced in the story, and yet their names are not mentioned.
Yeah.
Because I think Scrooge I'm sure he knows their names, but he might as well not know their names, because they're just not real people to him. They don't live in any kind of relationship.
And that's striking in light of the fact that, especially with his nephew, whom we later know as Fred,
Yeah.
right, has significant dialogue.
He does.
In the stave.
Yes.
It's not like he's just kind of a passerby.
These are not minor characters.
Yeah.
They're major characters.
One of the things that struck me also in this recent reading is his first words, the nephew's first words to Scrooge. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you."
Yep.
I mean, so one of the things I like to pay, in my next read through, I'm going to pay even closer attention to these things,
Sure.
I think. But
Sure.
but the prayers of A
Yep.
Christmas Carol, the very first prayer, a one-sentence prayer, God save you.
Yeah.
And I think what we see in the rest of the story is God says, yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, so let's go there. This. I think Jacob and I both feel like this is kind of the key, the interpretive key to the story, right? Is that Fred is introducing something that is going to unlock everything else that happens. Because one of the things that's interesting in Stave 1 is that when Marley shows up, he's been dead 7 years, and he says explicitly that he's been with Scrooge that entire time. He's often sat beside him on a night or in the counting house. He's been there the whole time. He's been haunting Scrooge, and Marley himself does not know why Scrooge is now able to see him. Why is Scrooge able to see him? Why do these three spirits now come to Scrooge with this redemptive purpose? Why didn't they come 7 years before or 20 years before? And I think it is at least plausible to say that it is Fred's prayer, which most readers aren't even going to realize is a prayer. They're going to just take it as a greeting, right? God save you, right? The Lord bless you. But really, those greetings are themselves prayers for God to bless and for God to save. And what do we see in the unfolding of the story? We see Scrooge get saved. That's what happens. And just to underline that, again, talking about the antithesis between what we see in Stave 1 and Stave 5, what is the first thing that Scrooge does on Christmas morning when he is finally completed this journey with these three spirits? He flings open the windows. He begins providing for the poor. He begins welcoming with joy those whom he sees, and then he gets dressed and he goes to church. The very first thing he does is he gets dressed and he goes to church. And then he goes on with the rest of the Christmas holiday that he himself has not enjoyed in decades. And I think you're seeing that come full circle. What are you seeing in Stave 5? You're seeing that God answered Fred's prayer. God save you, and the Lord says, okay.
Yeah. if you read A Christmas Carol in any other way than it being a story of mercy and grace from God,
Yeah.
you've erred. You've
Badly.
You've really
Badly.
missed the mark, right? One of the things that, in relation to the same conversation, so Scrooge, when he arrives at his home, of course, famously, and most everybody knows, you've seen Marley's face in the knocker, which
Right.
unnerves him a bit, but he's like, no, it's fine, and he gets up to his room. Well, there's a bell in his room, and that bell, it notes, I'm trying to find the part here, but it notes that bell is connected to the uppermost room in the house, and this bell begins to ring, and after the bell stops ringing, he hears this sound of chains being dragged over the barrels of wine in the cellar. Right. And so you have, two thoughts emerge in my mind in this kind of depiction of things. One, you have the idea that the house is literally haunted top to bottom.
Right.
So it's just this kind of pervasiveness of where could Scrooge go to get away from this? There's nowhere. But the other thing that I find even more provoking, and I'm going to give credit to my wife because she actually made this observation and I found it rather profound, right, was that the bell tolling from the top of the house really signifies heaven's involvement.
Yeah.
That heaven is getting involved in Scrooge's affairs, and yet it's calling a son of hell to do its work.
That's right. Which we see in Scripture.
Absolutely.
Let me read this passage. After several turns, he sat down again as he threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. So the bell in the highest story,
Yes.
ringing and summoning the spirit, the damned spirit from below, who now rises out of the cellar, out of the grave, and moves directly toward Scrooge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we see numerous places in Scripture where God does something like this. Anyway, we see that. Even God sending a tormenting spirit to Saul, right, which is obviously not an act of grace or redemption in that case, but it does clearly portray the idea that all is at God's disposal to do His will, right?
Exactly.
But one of the things I think is fascinating about this particular take, and I'd like your thoughts on this, Joel. So this is obviously an act of grace. God is answering Fred's prayer for his uncle, and he's in the midst of doing that. He is calling a son of hell to be part of that. Do you take Dickens as saying that this is actually a act of mercy and grace and kindness even to this damned spirit? And the reason I ask that is because, as you've already noted, he says how often he's sat there by him before. He clearly expresses a longing to be able to interact in the affairs of mankind as all other condemned spirits like himself do, but an inability. But here he is, like, I don't know how you're able to see me, but you can, And it's also interesting that the language of the book actually says that that Marley's ghost is the one who's procured these other spirits.
Right.
So he's actually involved. So I don't know. What do you make of that? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't take it as a picture of Marley's postmortem salvation, and one of the reasons would be in the conversation that Marley has with him. He said, Scrooge says first of all to him, Scrooge fell upon his knees, clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said, "dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" And he answers, "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chains, and wrung its shadowy hands.
Yeah.
So I don't see him as receiving mercy in this. I see it actually as kind of part of his punishment. And again, here is a explicit statement by Dickens giving you a clue to the final turn of the story, and that is that salvation is enjoyed in community, that joy and peace are meant to be experienced and enjoyed together with other people. Man's spirit is appointed to walk through the earth, and if he doesn't do it in life, he will do it in death, but in order to see a happiness that he can no longer share. And Marley says, "Woe is me," and he shakes his chains and he wrings his hands. So I don't see this as post-mortem salvation. I see it actually more as God's assignment in his torment is to actually kind of see all of the joy that he has missed out on, and yet God is going to turn that for good for Scrooge, who is ultimately going to be redeemed by it.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think there's I don't think it's a redemption story for Marley. I guess what I was curious about, though, I mean, agreeing completely with everything you just said, it still seems a bit of a mercy in my mind.
Yeah.
And now, I'm going to affirm, theologically, I don't think those who are damned are actually penitents. I don't think that they, that's not my understanding of that at all.
Right.
And yet, here Marley gets to do something he's longed to do. So, and by the permission of heaven. So that, in that sense, is all I'm trying to say, I guess. That
no, I think it connects actually to a text of Scripture, and we have to be careful with this point. But Luke chapter 16, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which I take to be a story, not a parable, an actual historical presentation, the rich man says, "If I cannot receive mercy, then please send Lazarus to warn my brothers not to come here." And so I do see that aspect in Marley's participation in this story, is that if there's mercy, it's not so much mercy for Marley as it is the mercy that he is allowed to participate in showing toward Scrooge.
Right.
And so Marley is damned and destined to be damned, but Scrooge can yet be saved.
Yes.
Now, I agree with you theologically. I don't think that even in that story, the rich man is repentant. There's a difference between experiencing regret and sorrow and even wanting someone else to be spared that same suffering. There's a difference between that and true biblical repentance. Yeah.
And of course, in the biblical story, he doesn't even get what he's asked for.
He
in
does
that
not.
Case. They said, "You've got
the
Moses
law
and the prophets.
That's right.
Let them read them."
That's right. Yeah.
So, I do think it's Marley's reference is really interesting. He says, "At this time of the rolling year, the spectre said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through the crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?"
Yeah, that's tragic. It's painful, and yet it's central to this idea that you must be drawn out of yourself, out of your selfishness, out of your greed, out of your misery. God is calling us to joy. He's calling us to joy, and if we refuse that gift of joy, we have only ourselves to blame. And that's the anguish that Marley's experiencing, is not how unfair this is. Look at what God has done to me, that I am damned. It's to say, look at what I've done to myself.
Yeah.
I could have followed that star, right? That joy to any number of houses where we could have celebrated together Christ.
Right.
And yet I would not.
Yeah. Yeah. Two more thoughts on this first stave, and maybe we want to dive into them at length, or maybe just kind of just brush on them. But one of them I think is interesting is kind of the idea of the senses and reason and how it is used in the story. So when Marley first appears, the ghost of Marley, I should say, appears, because I want to touch on that. I wasn't even thinking about this, but I want to touch on this too, right? Yeah. It's interesting that when the ghost of Marley is being described by Dickens, never once by Dickens. Now Scrooge kind of refers to him in this way, but Dickens never refers to him with personal pronouns.
Yeah.
Well, as far as he or him, right? It's only ever an it.
Yes. Yes.
And it's the ghost of Marley.
Right.
And Marley, in fact, doesn't allow Scrooge to ask him, "Who are you?" but rather ask me who I was.
Yes.
What's the significance in that?
I think the point is that Marley is disembodied, and therefore, in a very real sense, he is not human. And I want to be cautious in how I say this, to say that we're not suggesting that the dead have ceased to exist, certainly, right. And we're not even suggesting that they have lost their destiny to full humanity, and yet disembodiment sunders something that God has joined together, and human beings are not truly fully human in a disembodied form.
Yeah.
And so I think you're seeing that, is that Marley has become an it rather than a he or a who.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think I would go a little further and say that in Marley's case, he's not just in disembodied spirit, as we know that Christians, for a time,
in an intermediate state.
Right, will have an intermediate state like that. But he's a damned spirit.
Right.
Right, who will, he's really falling away from the image of God.
He's no longer an image bearer.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, and it seems clearly to be implied by Dickens. And I don't know how theologically insightful he was
how fully he worked
in
that
framing
out.
this, but certainly the point is there that Marley's ghost is not Marley in his fullness.
Where I was going before I got happily sidetracked back to that point
right.
that I did want to make. It talks about when Marley's ghost first appears. It emphasizes that the cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise. Down the page a little later, it says, though he looked at the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes. So it goes on and just it uses all of these terminologies of the senses, right? He heard, he saw, he felt. It's engaging the senses here. And part of the conversation that goes on here is he's trying so hard to disbelieve what he sees, what he hears, what he feels. And in fact, Marley's ghost will ask him, by what other evidence? He says, what evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know, said Scrooge. And he's, why do you doubt your senses? And of course, he famously goes on to say, well, it's just, you might be a blob of undigested mustard or something like that,
That's right.
But one of the things that occurred to me, again, this is a bit of a supposition, I don't know, but Dickens lives in an era where there's been kind of a rejection of authority, a rejection of the tradition of the church, and you have a lot of philosophers in this age who are even actually starting to question the senses themselves, right? The unreliability that you can't even know what you think you see.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if he's using this to kind of poke at that a little bit.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because the way that I take that is that Scrooge is a materialist, right? He's just strictly a materialist, a naturalist. He's wanting an empirical, kind of adopting an empiricist view of reality, and therefore he doesn't know how to process this ghost that has shown up.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is that reality cannot be fully understood in a naturalistic scheme. There has to be a supernatural perspective. But Dickens may be playing with some of the rise of rationalism and some of the philosophies that are certainly in play at that time.
It just even made me think of Hume and Kant.
Sure.
I don't know. So, but yeah, just thought. Let's move on to Stave 2. Let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah.
So, I think first off, let's just start. So, Marley's ghost promised him 3 visiting ghosts spirits that would come after, and that they're coming solely on a mission of Scrooge's salvation. So these are every single one of these, no matter how they appear, are mercy visits. So what's the first ghost like?
Yeah, so the spirit of the past, right, of Christmas past, and I'm looking for the specific description of the form.
I think I can get it to you here real quick.
I've got it.
Right,
It
cool.
was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using in its duller moments a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm.
It's a fascinating description, and I think what we come to see is that this strange, shape-shifting, almost kind of, is it young, is it old, how many legs and arms does it have, and I think what we come to realize is that this Ghost of Christmas Past is actually an amalgamation of all the people Scrooge has ever known. So this is why you have this kind of constantly changing, how does it look, because it's something of everybody.
Yeah.
So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I also wonder to what extent might Dickens be saying here that the past is neither young nor old. It is.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, and that it kind of embodies some of all of those qualities. I think we could talk, maybe not today, but at another time, about the strength of the upper body, the arms and the hands, and the delicacy of the lower. I think that there's something being suggested there about the nature of the past, right? But the idea that it's neither a child nor an old man, and yet you can see both in it. Because the past is now beyond time, right? It is what it is. It is fixed. And it doesn't matter whether it happened a day ago or 1,000 years ago. It is what it is, right? And there's no variability to it anymore.
And one of the things that's characteristic of this ghost, and actually the next one also, is light.
Yes.
There's a burning flame from the crown of the head of this ghost.
Right.
And actually it says, let's see here. I think I lost my place on that one. Sorry. I did totally lose my place.
Which one were you looking for?
Next page. Here we go.
Okay.
I got it.
Got it.
So it says that Scrooge had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered, right? So I like this idea that Scrooge, in his state, as we've met him so far, he cannot bear the light.
Right.
It is just overwhelming to him.
Yes.
And he desires to extinguish it instantly.
And not only that, but he has made that cap without knowing that he made it. The ghost's response,
Yes.
"What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and force me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" It is Scrooge and those like Scrooge who want to extinguish the light that the past could give to us. This light that he gives, it is a gift. It is a grace. It is illumination. Remember, stave one, Scrooge, like Marley, lives in the dark. He fumbles around. He feels his way to the door that he knows, because he lives in the darkness. And it is because he does not want the light of truth, the enlightenment, that a consideration of not the distant past. Remember, this is not the ghost of long past, but the ghost of your past, the Spirit says, right? And the truth that could be learned from that Spirit. Scrooge doesn't want it, right? And so in that stubborn refusal to look in the rearview mirror and to learn, to examine himself and to learn, and by that grow wise, in that stubborn refusal, he's made this cap to extinguish the light, right? Suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. One of the things that's super fascinating to me, and again, this is one of the things where, however many adaptations I've seen of this movie, I don't think I've ever seen one that's done this right. There might be one that does it right, but typically the Ghost of Christmas Past in the various movies and productions I've seen invites Scrooge to either take them by the hand, right, or grab the hem of their garment, which we do see in the Ghost of Christmas Present. I think he clutches onto his hem of his garment at one point. I think that's right. But here, in this case, that's not what happens at all.
Right.
The Ghost of Christmas Past actually says, he says, "Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the Spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this." Mm-hmm. So Scrooge is fearful that he's, they're going to go out this window or something and he's going to fall to his death, But the ghost says, no. You just allow me to place my hand upon your heart, and you'll be uplifted not only from falling physically, but you're going to be held up in a number of other ways.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is the turning point, right?
Yeah, this is a regenerative moment.
I think it is. Here is Scrooge's new birth,
yes,
right? The heart of stone is being replaced with a heart of flesh. The Spirit has come to do the work of the Holy Spirit.
And do you notice how that change is instantly characterized throughout the rest of the
yes.
stave?
Yes.
He's weeping the entire time.
Right.
Every single
yes.
thing he sees.
He's also beginning to rejoice in some of the memories.
Yes.
So it's this bittersweet tier,
yes,
that there is now the presence of joy that he once had, that he now remembers, and by which he is gaining wisdom. And I really do think this is the turning point. So hopefully, as we're talking about this, people are following along. What has made the difference? Fred has prayed, "God save you." And God says, okay. And he sends Marley, who now sends these spirits. And this first spirit, what is he going to do? He's going to transform Scrooge's heart so that now he can see the light, so that now he can live in the light. He can learn from the light and ultimately become a new man.
So let's talk a little bit about what this ghost does with him, where he takes him, and maybe in the midst of that, it's interesting, unintentionally connecting themes here from our last episode to this one, but we talked about how important remembering is in the giver.
Yes.
And now remembering is, again, just very important in the story. So what does the ghost do with Scrooge, and how is remembering an important part of Scrooge's kind of redemption?
Yeah, I think he takes him back to where he was, right? Even as a child, even as a young person, the sister coming to bring him home for Christmas from the boarding school, when very clearly there had been some kind of difficulty or estrangement with father, and yet now there is reconciliation happening. And then the memory of other earlier periods in his life, many of which came with joy, and some of the latter parts with some bitterness and grief. He's going to take him back through his own life so that he can see God's hand of providence. Because providence is read in reverse. You don't read the tea leaves of providence in the present. You look backwards and you're able to see it, see the hand of God. And Scrooge has moved away from that in many ways. Now, we might say that there were some early indications of the trajectory that his life would follow, at least for this period of time thus far. But nevertheless, there was that past, that remembered past, that ultimately held some key ideas for the recovery of joy, if Scrooge is willing.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I noticed is just that solitary, as soul and solitary as we constantly see emphasized Scrooge is in his life at this point in his adult life. We see a lot of solitariness in his young life as well.
Yes.
So the young boy at the schoolhouse is alone.
Yes.
He's alone on Christmas.
Yes.
And yet he's actually not entirely alone, which is also kind of interesting. Who is it that turns out to be his dear friends in moments of loneliness?
Yeah.
So he turns out to be good friends with somebody named Alibaba. Mm-hmm. He's good friends with Robinson Crusoe. Right. I think it's kind of interesting. He took solace in his loneliness in stories.
Yes.
Reading great literature.
Yes.
Right. I don't know how much to make of that here.
Right.
I don't know how much that ultimately affects the overall story, but it's still a precious thing to me that when he didn't have anything else, he did have literary friends.
Right,
I thought
right.
that's kind of interesting.
And it seems to be something that he's moved away from.
Yeah,
that,
that's true.
You know, again, that is part of what the Ghost of Christmas Past is reminding him of, are
a
the
good point.
the values and virtues that he encountered in those stories that are in no way represented in his life now as an adult.
Yes, because we don't see, even though he was solitary, and things that, you know, would make life hard for him as a young man, we don't see the kind of wretchedness in him that we see later, right?
Right.
And it's probably because he is still clinging to good things. He has great literature, perhaps, as part of his life. He has a sister whom he loves that loves him. That's an anchor for him. He has, a little bit later, we see that he has a good master. He ends up working for a gentleman named Fezziwig, right? So there's some things that are maybe kind of keeping him anchored that, for one reason or another, he lets go of or loses hold of.
Yeah, this is the mystery to me that I mentioned to you earlier, is what makes Scrooge Scrooge.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't the influence of Fezziwig, which his influence would have been altogether positive.
Yeah, very much
right?
so.
It wasn't a permanent estrangement from his family, because again, his sister is showing up to draw him back into community, in the home. It wasn't a lack of love, because we know that he was engaged to a woman that he cared about and that evidently cared about him.
Yes.
And yet that engagement is broken off because of the turn in his character.
Yes.
And the fact that he has fallen in love with something else, that being his business and his money, and which really becomes a miserable master and brings him into bondage for the rest of his adult life.
Yeah, it's pointed out in several different ways throughout the story that although he is greatly wealthy, it's not wealth to any real meaningful effect in his life. He doesn't spend it for his own pleasure.
No.
He hoards it.
Yes.
Even the description of, he has some nice things, but the description of his dwellings, they're not decadent.
No, no, by no means.
And yeah, obviously he's not using that to help other people. I mean, it's just wealth for wealth's sake. It's hoarding it to no end. And so it is interesting. What may have driven him there? I think my theory is fear. I think that, there's ways of understanding why this might be. People who have faced times of real lean scenarios. You think of people who went through the Great Depression, for instance, right? And fear of ever being in that same spot, being able to not afford food, not afford the basics of life, Perhaps that's what underlied some of his decision making, that he just said, I will never allow myself to be in such dire straits again. Or I don't know. I mean, it's just conjecture.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, I don't think that Dickens explains it. I think, if nothing else, it serves as a cautionary warning about loving the world and the things of the world.
Yeah.
Whatever was the kind of the point of origin for Scrooge's, decline into the bondage of lust and greed, very clearly it is a type of bondage.
Yeah.
And it really, part of what we learn in this second stave is that Scrooge's life was full of good things in many, many ways, and for many years.
Yeah.
And he has lost all of that. Yeah. And it is now, the part of his misery is in coming to terms, part of his repentance is in coming to terms with the harm that he has done to himself, the surrender that he has made of every good thing that he was given. And that what he has traded it for was not worth the trade at all.
No, whatever he hoped to gain, whatever he thought was worth pursuing, turned out really not to be. And one of the things, though, I want to mention this before we move beyond stave 2 for sure. So when he sees himself as a young boy, lonely, right, and going through difficult, lonesome times in the schoolhouse, it reminds him of something we didn't mention in the first day, but it reminds him of the young boy who came and tried to sing a Christmas carol to him,
right?
Whom he ushers off in no ceremonial way. But as he sees his former self, it says, in pity for his former self, poor boy, and he cried again. I wish, Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. But it's too late now. What is the matter? Asked the spirit. Nothing, said Scrooge, nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something. That's all.
Right.
So we see that's here, and we also after we see this kind of party that happens at Fezziwigs, which is, boy, what a party.
Right,
Maybe
right.
we can talk about that here in just a
Yeah.
second too. But we see that he also thinks of Cratchit, his clerk.
Yeah.
And he thinks, I should treat him differently a little bit, right?
Right.
You know, and so it's interesting that what Dickens is doing is actually by helping Scrooge remember his past, remember his own situation, and identify different times in his own life, different parts of himself with people in his life now.
Yeah.
He's teaching empathy to Scrooge.
Yeah.
He's teaching him to actually have compassion.
But a much more biblical empathy, which I'm not super crazy about that word, but a more biblical compassion than what we see by that name today. You think about the trajectory that he has Scrooge on. It is this regeneration. It's this new
Right.
birth that enables him to see in the memory of his own desolation the moral obligation to help those who are so desolate. And as opposed to what you hear a lot today, which is a lot of self-pity, a lot of a victim mentality, a lot of woe is me, and I am the most persecuted and the most, sorrowful person that has ever lived. That's not what you get from the Christmas Carol at all. Like, he's not looking back and saying, boy, wasn't my life hard, or weren't these things sad? He's saying, isn't it sad that I have squandered the opportunity to lift someone up
Yes.
who might find themselves in similar circumstances?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could have helped that poor boy
Right.
singing that carol to me. I
Right.
could have made his day better. I could have taken maybe the loneliness or the worries that he has and taken those off of him, like somebody could have done for me
Yes.
back then, or somebody did maybe do for me eventually back then. And as good of a master as Fezziwig is, and how he just loved and open-handedly gave and gave and gave. Here I have this clerk who I won't even let put another shovel of coal in the
Right,
fire, you
right.
know, and it's just really, it's hitting deep.
This raises an important point that maybe it's appropriate to mention it here, and that is if for a lot of people, if they see the religious themes of this book, they are going to be tempted to interpret it in kind of a moralistic way,
Right.
as a type of legalism. Scrooge is going to be safe because now he's going to become a generous person. Now he's going to help
Yep.
the poor, and that's his redemption. But if you're reading the story, it's not that at all. I mean, it's quite the opposite. The salvation of Scrooge is in the heart change.
Yeah.
It's in the illumination, it's in the remembrance, it's in the paradigm shift that's brought about as these spirits visit him, that is then attested to by the changed life.
Yes.
And there's certainly fruit of repentance and there's good works, but it's all the fruit and evidence of that prior work of grace, of that change. So, I mean, I think A Christmas Carol is very consistent with, for example, a Protestant understanding of salvation. And I think to read it in a more legalistic or works-based fashion is really to misread what's going on in the story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I would say again, when the ghost touched his heart, that's actually the moment of regeneration. That's
Yeah.
the moment that this has become a new man, and now the ghosts are going to have this process of kind of filling this new heart with the content of memory and seeing truth and goodness and beauty in the world, and even warnings of the future, so that that heart can stay on course
Yes.
from now on.
Yes.
And one of the things that, I mean, that's so evident, if you say, oh, no, I don't know that Scrooge has really changed yet. He's maybe stubborn until the very last moment. Actually, no.
Yeah.
By the time the second ghost shows up, his attitude is completely different. Let's see here. He says to the ghost, hang on. We'll just go ahead and put a pause.
I think I know where you're going. In the third stave, when the second spirit shows up, and Scrooge welcomes him in, the ghost of Christmas present rose. Spirit, said Scrooge submissively, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
That's it. That's the part I was looking. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Yeah, I mean, so he's really got a completely different
He's
attitude.
submissive.
I mean, he went
He
from
sees what's happened.
trying to tell Marley to go away and to telling the first ghost, I'm not interested in you being here, to saying, I've already greatly benefited from what's happened to me. Please keep doing the work that you've begun.
Yes. Yes.
That's an interesting
He's
statement.
saved.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
The change has happened, and now what you're seeing is the instruction of the catechumen.
Yes.
Right, you're seeing the sanctification of the new believer, and that's what this story is all about. It's what it's all about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about the second ghost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Second spirit.
So the second spirit. Let's see here. I can get there on the page.
Scrooge grabs his robe, and let me just read this because it sets up a theme that I know we talked about a little bit before we started recording. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, pudding, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The arrival of the Ghost of Christmas Present was accompanied by this lavish feast.
Abundance.
And just abundance. And then even when that disappears and the ghost says, okay, let's go, and they're going to go out into the city streets, and now it's Christmas morning, and yet even there, despite the severity of the weather, there is the delight of these boys in seeing the snow come plumping down. And, it's just a powerful, powerful picture of what is going to be characteristic of this second spirit, which is the joy and joviality of Christmas as it presently is, or maybe we should say could be, if Scrooge's heart is truly changed.
Yes, and really just this theme of festivity that runs through the book, the appropriate attitude for the time of year, which again, Fezziwig and his party, boy, did he do it right? I mean,
exactly.
he spared no expense, although the ghost notes didn't really cost him that much in the grand scheme of things, but nonetheless, he had the fire roaring, he had plenty of food, they had dance, he paid a violinist to come fiddle for him. I mean, and here you get to this, you're seeing everybody is just enlivened with this spirit of Christmas.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be delighted more about even common things, right?
Yes. In fact, he goes out blessing, carrying Scrooge with him through the town and blessing the various people that are passing by. For example, it says a little bit later, the sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as the bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said, it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is. My own. So part of what he's bringing is joy and peace and reconciliation. It's not appropriate to quarrel on Christmas Day, and so even when two people bump into each other and begin to have cross words, he just sprinkles. But there it's not incense, you notice. There it's water.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the baptism of joy, right? The blessing of peace.
Thankfulness.
Yeah,
right.
And that's what he's distributing, and he's distributing it to their food so that, you've got this invisible spirit as people are carrying their Christmas dinners home to cook. He's opening the dishes, and he's just putting a little bit of joy in with everyone.
Yeah. And this is one of the themes of the book as well. So obviously one thing that the Christmas Carol, or A Christmas Carol, focuses on is the very real poverty that is characteristic of London at this time, that many people are living without enough.
All of Dickens' novels.
Yeah, sure, right. Yeah, that's true. But in light of that, even despite that, one of the themes of this book is that those who have very little rejoice in riches of family and in good things, and give appropriate thanks to God for these things, whereas pretty much everybody who's shown to be truly wealthy in this book is miserable.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's interesting. Just that that he does focus on the fact that it doesn't. You know, I think even in the initial interchange between his nephew Fred and him, this is, you know, what right do you have to be merry? You're poor enough, and his shoots right back. What right do you have to be miserable? You're rich enough.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
Which just is Dickens telling us, look, you know, wealth or poverty doesn't get to dictate your happiness.
Exactly.
And I think that's an important point. So
it's a very important point. In fact, I think it speaks to one of the key themes and takeaways from the story, and that is the moral obligation of joy. The moral obligation of cheerfulness and of thankfulness, no matter your physical circumstances. So yeah, Fred is not wealthy, and yet there is a great deal of merriment and joy, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second in this stave. But even the Cratchits, who are very poor and are really poor under the thumb of Scrooge, because he has the power, and we would say the obligation, of actually raising their standards, and yet in the midst of poverty and in the midst of illness, there is still joy and merriment, and you even see this just precious scene where, as the Cratchits are gathering together, their oldest daughter Martha being out of the house, right, and is she going to come home? And so she comes home and she hides, right, and Bob comes in and says, "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from the church and had come home rampant. He'd been carrying Tiny Tim on his shoulders. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house that he might hear the puddin' singing in the copper. That's powerful, and I mean, thinking about that, reading that, you know, with a daughter about to leave our home, just the joy of that family, and the love in that family, and the intimacy in that family, in the midst of deep poverty. Yeah. It doesn't matter. Yeah. You have a moral obligation to rejoice and to be thankful, because God is good, and if anybody should be thankful in God's goodness, it ought to be Scrooge, right? But he's not.
Yeah, the true riches lie elsewhere.
Yes. Yes.
But at the same time, having actual real monetary wealth, right, is a gift from God.
Absolutely.
But it comes with responsibility, right?
Exactly.
Now, one thing I wanted to note that I think some people will read this book and come away with a wrong idea also is this kind of social gospel.
Yep.
So, and this plays into what you said earlier about, well, now he's got to go save himself by doing a bunch of good works, which is clearly not the idea. But even people who don't think that might think, well, but so Scrooge is really obligated to maybe set up social programs or, you know, something along those lines. But Dickens' point primarily seems to be, especially when you see the examples that that Scrooge is taken to, is more of the Good Samaritan, don't walk by on the other side of the road.
Right.
Don't step over the people that God places in your path, right? So Scrooge has this responsibility to love and care for Bob Cratchit. Mm-hmm. Scrooge has a responsibility to love and care for his nephew. You and I have a responsibility to love and care for the people that God puts in our path, in our day, right? We can't necessarily save the world from hunger individually, you know, and no amount of soup kitchens will necessarily do that. Not to say that it's bad to be involved with that. Yeah. But I think it's just an important point that that's not the issue. The issue isn't that, well, we just need to set up social programs and that's the real point of Christianity is to feed the poor. No, the real point is to love with the love of Christ those whom God puts in your life.
That's exactly right. And clearly in the story, if we do love in that way, if we love as we have been loved by God in Christ, then we are going to desire as much as lies within us to help the poor. Absolutely. And to do good. And you even see that again in this antithetical parallelism of the first and the fifth stave, where there are the men who come by from the benevolent agency looking for looking for support, looking for a donation, and Scrooge says, "What, are there not workhouses? Are there not prisons? And if they're destined to die, maybe they should get on with it." Yeah. And of course that gets evoked, that gets recalled by the ghosts in very powerful ways. But then in the fifth stave, Scrooge encounters one of those men again, and offers what is apparently a extremely
Sizable sum.
generous, a very sizable sum. And as he puts it, he says, there's some making up that he has to do for what he hasn't given before. And so again, it's not a social gospel picture. It's not salvation by good works, but it is the fruit of salvation, the fruit of gratefulness for what God has done is in sharing as stewards of that goodness with others who are less fortunate.
It's not a cold, dead, dark heart that doesn't care about what's around them.
Exactly.
So.
Yes.
So we do see, you read a great little excerpt from the Cratchit family. There's so much you could enjoy about the love that they share and the way that comes across, and rejoicing in this pitiful little goose, but nobody willing to say it's anything but the best goose they've ever seen, and things like that, But we also in this day have Scrooge is taken to Fred and his nephew, who gets named now Fred, right? And sees this party that's going on at his house and gets to enjoy that as well. What about that particular incident stands out to you?
Yeah, it's interesting to me the way that you see Fred's genuineness in what he says about Scrooge behind his back.
Yeah. Right?
The best compliment you can ever give a person is what you say behind their back, because oftentimes people will say one thing to your face and something else behind your back. But Fred is not that way. I mean, he and his friends, they acknowledge that Scrooge is this crotchety old man, this cranky old man who is altogether ungrateful and who is a bit of a bear, right? And so they have their fun with that, and yet there is just this genuine love for and desire for Scrooge to be lifted from his misery and to enter into the joy that they know.
Yeah, he's talking about Scrooge to his wife and to his friends that are at this party, and he says his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear? Said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
It
right?
really is.
He's just a genuine man who loves his uncle and who realizes that his uncle has done this to himself.
Yeah.
Right, and the punishment for sin is sin, as Augustine said, and Scrooge has slit his own wrists in this regard. Right, cut himself off from joy.
But he intends to ask him year after year again.
That's right.
Not going to give up,
He's
right?
going to persist.
And of course, in the end, in stave 5, we see that Scrooge does actually show up to the great shock of everyone, but to the utter joy of Fred. He's genuinely thankful and glad. In fact, everybody receives him with thankfulness and gladness, right? I mean, if any time of year you're going to be thankful that somebody's had a change of heart, right? That's kind of the idea.
Indeed. All right, what about stave 4?
Oh, goodness. So the third and final ghost, he is something else. Not something unexpected. So we've noted already that the first two ghosts are characterized in part by fire and brightness. So the first ghost has this kind of flaming torch upon its crown, its head. The second ghost has this torch that it carries with it, which you said you're sprinkling joy and blessing upon people's food and everything like that, right? And this third ghost, whatever Scrooge is thinking, I mean, he is not ready for what is coming his way now. It says, the phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. That is, I mean, quite a picture.
Absolutely.
Why is this the ghost of Christmas Future? I mean, why is Dickens trying to portray him so differently than the other two ghosts?
Yeah.
How does this associate with things yet to come.
Yeah, I think because, as we said, the past is what it is, and it has much to teach us. It has much by which it can illuminate truth and enlighten hearts. The Ghost of Christmas Present, I mean, he's this big, jolly, robust giant of a spirit who brings light and joy and dispenses blessing everywhere he goes. Here is the opportunity that is before them. But the Ghost of Christmas to come, the future, is dark and uncertain and silent. Because the future can't teach you yet, because the future hasn't been yet.
Right.
And so he points the way. He points to potentialities. He points to possible outcomes.
Yeah.
But the future has not yet been actualized yet.
Right.
And so there is this ominous, this foreboding associated with his presence, because the trajectory that Scrooge's life has been on thus far, well, I mean, the Spirit shows him where that ends.
Yes.
Yeah.
For, further proof of the regeneration of Scrooge, we saw that he had learned already from the first ghost, and he's more readily receiving the second ghost, and now he comes to this third ghost, and he's terrified. This is dread, this is fear before him, and yet this is what he says: "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any specter I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?"
Yeah.
I mean, that's just...
He's a changed man.
Yeah.
He's a changed man. Absolutely.
Because he's not just looking at a jovial, happy guy anymore and being willing to say, yeah, I can learn from you. He's looking at a picture of death.
Yeah.
Of obscurity, I mean, I don't even know how to characterize some of this. But...
And again, this is where, going back to the beginning of our conversation, admittedly, I may have seen 2 film adaptations of this sort, maybe one. I've seen it on stage. But I don't recall in the few adaptations that I've seen this point being brought out very clearly of the fact that the change happens at the beginning of the first spirit's visit, and that the transformation has already begun and is simply proceeding through this, that Scrooge is not an unwilling partner as these 3 visits proceed. He is not dragging his feet. He is not wishing that it were over and that this had never happened at all. He's embracing this because he realizes the necessity of it. As ominous as this third visit is, he still sees the benefit of it.
Yeah, I think in various portrayals of this story, some have done better than others. Again, I'll put in my plug that Muppets actually does fairly well with it.
Okay.
But at the same time, the book does a much better job always, and it really, Scrooge kind of embraces these further visits like one embraces a surgeon.
Yeah.
Like I know that I know that I need this cutting knife to kind of get that cancer out of me. Right. So that seems to be how he engages here.
So one of the things that the third spirit shows to him is a man who has died and whose body, like the clothes on his body, have been robbed.
Yeah.
And his home has been robbed.
His bed curtains.
His bed curtains have been robbed.
Right.
And now there are thieves, grave robbers essentially, who are pawning his stuff.
Yeah.
And Scrooge,
most likely his own servants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Scrooge imagines that what the spirit is trying to tell him is that unless he repents, this would be his own fate also. What he doesn't realize is that the spirit is actually showing him himself.
Yeah, there's a moment where he sees the body lying on the bed, but the way the window coverings are, you can't quite see the face, and he wants to pull back the curtain to see the truth, but he just cannot physically do it. Right?
Yeah.
It seems maybe in his heart of hearts he really already knows.
He should.
But he's trying not to,
Right.
Identify with what he's looking at. One of the things that was so chilling about that section, and I'm not even trying to find. Oh, I can find it right away, so I'm going to say it. Okay, it says a cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. Mm-hmm. What a horrifying picture.
Yeah.
But it's really important to let this picture sink in and then contrast it with another picture that we're about to be shown.
Yep.
Because you have a man who's died, no one to care,
right?
No one to look over his body, no one to see to him that he's respected with dignity. This cold, dark, empty room with apparently the imminent threat of damage being done to the corpse by animals.
Right.
Right. That's the picture of his end.
Yep.
If things don't change, right? And this contrasted though with another sad and yet beautiful picture. And so Scrooge asks for it. He says, "Can you show me any kind of tenderness that's connected to death?
Yeah.
Can death ever lead to something more soft, more precious than this horrid scene? Please show me that, because if you don't, I don't think I'll ever sleep again." It's kind of what he's getting at, right? So where does he go?
He takes him to Bob Cratchit's house. And what does he find there? The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire, quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. Which is the contrast to what he saw in the third stave with the Ghost of Christmas Present, where that house was full of noise.
Bustling.
Yeah, just life.
Overflowing with life, right?
Absolutely.
And although we didn't mention it, but there was also a passage where he saw the woman he would have possibly married at one time, married with lots of children, right? Yes. And just this, I mean, it's actually a really beautiful passage too, right? Yeah. The father walking in with presents in his pockets and the children just marauding him, I mean, it's really beautiful. Right. But yeah, so these pictures of life and love and family. So, but yeah, you see this contrast, and actually you mentioned the book that the young Cratchit boy Peter is holding isn't just any book, because he says he read a line from it, and he took the child and set him in the midst of them, and that's actually Mark 9:36. Right. It's not just a book.
He's reading the Bible.
It's the Bible. It's the book, right?
It's family worship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to read one more section. So Bob Cratchit has arrived home. He's been cheerful with his family. He's discussing that they've made arrangements for the burial of little Tiny Tim. But there's even though there's sadness, he breaks down in tears. There's still a cheerfulness and a joy in that family. And there's this section where he goes up to see little Tiny Tim's body, and this is how it reads: he left the room and he went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't contrast those scenes more.
Right.
This child has been loved. This child has been guarded. It's a warm, bright room, still decorated with Christmas. Mm-hmm. People have been with the body and cared for it. By the way, still talking about this body in personal language.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
And I'm really moved by this scene too, probably in part because of what I've been writing in my dissertation recently about the concept of virtue and happiness, and how so much of the world identifies happiness with this kind of like psychological emotional response. Like this is a miserable time for this family. Their beloved little child has died. But Bob is able to reconcile himself to the fact and to be very happy.
Yep.
That can't make sense outside of the Christian worldview.
Right.
That can't make sense out of people who are able to actually come to grips with, my happiness is wrapped up in more than just this moment of sadness. It's wrapped up in my God, the gifts that my God gives me, my family. I'll see that child again one day.
Right. Yep.
Only a Christian father.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's a powerful, powerful scene. Yeah.
So what else? What else should we talk about as we're coming to kind of a wrap?
Yeah.
Obviously, we've touched a little bit on Stave 5, just kind of bouncing back and forth, but
probably just move there just very briefly and just emphasize again the fact that this story is written with bookends.
Yeah.
The Stave 1 and Stave 5 are in antithetical parallelism, and they're meant to kind of show you the consummation of this redemption story.
Yeah.
And so Scrooge wakes up. He's had what seems to be multiple nights of experience with these very spirits, but he finds out that it was all one night.
Yeah.
And it's now Christmas morning.
Yeah. Kind of a mystical thing with time has
Right,
happened here,
right,
right? It's
yeah.
hard to understand. But of course the spirits can do anything they like, he says, right?
That's right.
Yeah, no, it's fun. It's a fun section to read. I mean, just because the way he acts. I mean, he had frisked into the sitting room and was now standing there perfectly winded. I mean, here's a guy who's probably not really experienced any real physical activity beyond just a brisk walk, maybe, you know, and he's winded himself just leaping around and screaming and for joy. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man, which, by the way, they always leave that line out of all the adaptations. A Merry Christmas to everybody. He's shouting to no one. There's no one there with him still, right? But he's screaming Merry Christmas to anybody. And then he pops open the window. He sees a young boy. And he sets in motion a plan,
Yes.
and it's just a beautiful thing. It's a big joke, but a happy joke to him, right? He's gonna send this prize turkey that is twice the size of Tiny Tim, right?
Right.
He's gonna send it to Bob Cratchit's house, and he's not gonna say who sent it. And that's definitely different than the adaptations. A lot of the adaptations typically have him showing up with the turkey and having that moment, which, you know, okay, but this is better, right? He's like, no, I'm just gonna send them this joy, this anonymous joy, right?
Yeah.
Of course, he's kind of setting him up a little bit too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he is.
because Cratchit, you know, is supposed to be there all the earlier the next morning, but the merriment that he sends his way, right, causes Cratchit to actually be like 15 minutes late to work or so, you know, and I do that is just such a funny part that's worth reading, because when he comes across Bob and he's going to give him a hard time about being late, he stands up and he says, "I'm going to raise your salary."
Right,
and I
right.
love this part. It says Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. So he's out of his mind. This man's going to kill me or something, and he doesn't know what to do with him.
A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
And one of the things we've got to know before obviously before the next day with Cratchit, before he goes to see his nephew Fred and spend Christmas evening with them in that party and enjoy it firsthand, one of the first things he actually does is he goes to church.
He goes to church. He shaves with a trembling hand. He puts on his very best. Now, there's another evidence, right, of this idea that you have a moral obligation to enjoy God's good gifts. And so he puts on his best clothes, and he goes out into the street, and he greets people with Merry Christmas, and he makes a donation to the benevolent agency, and then he goes to church.
I do love the line.
Goes to church.
Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention even when you don't dance while you're at it. You know, just the exuding joy. It's a beautiful. Everything about this book, from start to finish, is beautiful.
Amen.
I mean, I wouldn't change a thing. I don't think anybody has any right to try to change a thing about the story.
Right.
So, which I know is why you think there shouldn't be film adaptations. I
That
understand.
is why.
I understand.
That is why.
Right. But it is its enduring value is seen though in all those adaptations. The people can't leave it alone.
Yeah. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. If any man alive possessed the knowledge, may that be truly said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Well,
Great book.
Merry Christmas to all our listeners.
Yes, indeed. Merry Christmas to you all. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tolle Lege podcast. You know how to get in touch with us. Email us. Find us on Twitter, on Substack, on YouTube. We had a little bit of trouble with our YouTube, our last episode, so it was up for a few hours and then down after that, and so
We also had a dog barking incident.
Oh, yeah.
Your dog, who by the way is named Ender.
One of my dog's names is named Ender Wagons. I hope that everyone catches the reference. But he did curiously bark after some of our viewers voted in a poll that Ender's Game was superior to Starship Troopers, which it clearly is
We
not.
corrected them.
We corrected them, and Ender, my dog, objected
Yes.
to
yes,
our
he did.
correction.
Yes. But yes, please reach out to us. So you can reach us by email at tollelegepod@gmail.com. You can go to our newsletter on the Substack. Go to tollelegepod.substack.com or Twitter at tolle_lege_pod. There's all kinds of ways to get a hold of us. But we really want to hear from you, get your feedback, get your thoughts. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider leaving a review on whatever podcasting app or network you're catching us on. We're on iTunes, Spotify, I think Amazon, all kinds of things. So you can find us somewhere.
Yep, let us know what you think. Give us suggestions about other books that you want to see us discuss and ways that we can improve. We're enjoying the journey of learning how to do this together. And Jacob, I'm enjoying the opportunity to sit down and talk about books that we love.
Me as well.
All right, very good. Until next time.
Take up and read.